Hi, everyone. It's Deacon Greg with you once again in this middle school classes, going through our journey of the Old Testament. And today, I'd like to speak to you about a topic that comprises a good amount of the Old Testament books, and these are the prophets. Prophets were people that rose up in Israel in order to teach the people and let the people know when they were going off onto the wrong path, when they were sinning against God, when they were breaking the terms of the covenant, and when they needed a little attitude adjustment or to change their ways. So, prophets were very important for the nation of Israel because they were the monitors of God's covenant. They were the ones that dared to speak the unpleasant message that people didn't always do the right thing. So they used tough love. They used different ways of communicating messages to the people of Israel that they needed to change and they needed to be better. So let's look at these prophets for a moment in the Old Testament, and then we'll talk about how you and I can be prophets in our world today. So here's a quick video about God's prophets in the Old Testament.
God's story, the prophets. So, part of God's story is about the prophets, and it goes like this. Prophets are people who hear from God and share it. We sometimes think of prophets as people who know the future, but really, they know whatever God tells them, which could be anything, because God knows everything. Anyway, nowadays, God speaks to all of us. But before Jesus came and before there was the Bible, God spoke to his family through just a few people. Some of those people were prophets. 16 of God's prophets have books in the Bible named after them. And today, we are talking about them. It starts with Isaiah and ends with Malachi. These guys are a pretty big part of the Old Testament, so let's check out what God said to his family through them. This won't take long because even though they lived in different places and hundreds of years apart, they had basically the same message. Because people have always had the same problem. We disobey God. So the prophets told God's family, "You've sinned, now you're in trouble." Of course, the prophets didn't just say this. They got God's family's attention by doing crazy things to show how bad life can get when we're far from God. Like Isaiah, who walked around in his underwear for 3 years to show what it looks like to lose everything. Or Jeremiah, who hid his belt under a rock until it rotted, then dug it up again so God's family could see what it looks like to be completely destroyed. Seriously, kids, that's in the Bible. And actually, it gets even crazier. Check it out for yourself. See, God is holy, which means he's perfect. He created us to be like him and follow him, but instead, we choose to disobey him, which is sin. Sin has to be punished because if God is perfect, he can't pretend it doesn't matter when we hurt each other, or ourselves, or his creatures, or the earth. The thing is, though, God loves us anyway. He doesn't want his family to be in trouble, so he sent good news through the prophets too. They said, if you stop sinning and follow God instead, he'll have mercy on you. Mercy means not getting punished, even though you deserve it. Problem is, nobody could stop sinning for very long. Well, God had a plan for that too. He told some of the prophets, like Isaiah and Zechariah, that one day he would send someone perfect to earth. Someone who could take the punishment for everybody else's sin. And if our sin was paid for, that would mean we weren't in trouble anymore, which means we could come close to God. If 16 different prophets over hundreds of years all said pretty much the same thing, it must be important, right? Even now, for us. After all, we've sinned too, and we need a rescuer. And since the rescuer already came, we can follow God and choose to accept that Jesus took our punishment, which means it doesn't separate us from God anymore. And we can talk to God, but also hear from him, which means we can prophesy too. And that's the story of the prophets.
So think about how difficult it must have been to be a prophet in Israel back in the day, and still how difficult it is today to be a prophet. You have to tell people that they're doing something wrong. You have to have awkward and often difficult conversations with people. And people like Isaiah and Jeremiah and all the other prophets in the Old Testament were willing to do that. A lot of them didn't want to at first. One prophet ran away and tried to escape God's call. Another screamed that he was too young and no one would listen to him. Another one said he didn't have the proper speaking skills and no one would listen to him. But God was persistent, and God made sure that these people knew just how important their call was and how important it was to deliver God's message to the people who desperately needed to hear it. One particular prophet who doesn't have a book of the Bible named after him was the prophet Nathan. Nathan had a very important job to do in the story of King David. King David, that great king of Israel, who slew Goliath with his slingshot and is generally known as one of the greatest kings of all time of Israel. King David had an issue, a little bit of a sinful situation on his hands, and God called Nathan to speak to him about it. And here is a quick little video about that.
Was a man after God's own heart, and he was a good king too. He loved God and he tried to live and lead God's way. One night, David took a walk up to the roof of the palace where it was cool. When he got there, he looked over at another roof and noticed a woman. The woman's name was Bathsheba. David said to his servant,
"Go and tell that woman to come to the palace.
when David saw Bathsheba, he thought she was very beautiful.
She is so lovely. I want her to be mine."
But Bathsheba already had a husband named Uriah, a soldier who served in King David's army.
This is a problem.
So David made a terrible choice. I know, I'll have Uriah killed in battle. And that's what David did. Soon, David and Bathsheba were married. David had done a very bad thing. He should have felt very badly about it, but he didn't. He was just glad he didn't get caught.
No one will ever know.
One day, Nathan came to David. Nathan was a prophet who heard from God. He told David a story.
Once there were two men. One of them was rich, with lots of sheep and cattle. The other man was very poor. All he had was one little lamb. He loved the little lamb so much, he made it his pet. It ate and even slept in the house like part of the family. One day, the rich man had a visitor who was very hungry, and even though the rich man had hundreds of sheep of his own, he decided to go and steal the little pet lamb from his neighbor's house to cook for the visitor's dinner.
What that rich man did was so wrong. He should be punished.
The rich man is you. God knows what you have done. You had everything, all of the riches of the kingdom, and Uriah was poor and only had his wife, who he loved very much. Still, you took his wife away and you had him killed. God is going to punish you for this terrible, terrible thing. Bad things will happen in your family now.
David suddenly realized how terrible he had been. He felt awful and was very sorry for all he had done. So he cried out to God from his heart.
Lord, I'm so sorry. I know I have done things that are terrible in your sight. Will you forgive me?
The Lord knew what was in David's heart. He did not just say he was sorry. He really was sorry. The Lord forgave David of his sin.
So in that particular video, we hear about Nathan, who has to go to the king of Israel and deliver a very unpleasant message that God knows that you've sinned, God knows what you've done, and you should be sorry for it. So think about how nervous Nathan must have been delivering that message. David, as the king of Israel, could have had Nathan killed right there on the spot, but he didn't. David believed Nathan and believed that God was speaking through him and repented of his sin. So it never was easy to be a prophet. It certainly isn't today, and it never will be. Think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all of the messages that he delivered in helping to forward the civil rights movement. He did not want to be the leader of a civil rights movement. He wanted to retire as a minister of his parish. He wanted to live a quiet life with his family and his loved ones, but he also knew that God was calling him, that God had given him special skills to be able to run the civil rights movement and to make a positive change in the world. Martin Luther King Jr. knew that speaking this controversial message was like putting a target on his own back, and that he would be killed for the message that he was preaching. And yet, he decided to go through with it because he knew the message was more important than his own life. So he is a great example of a modern day prophet. What about you? Are you exposed to prophets in your life? Well, I would think that most of us would say that our parents are the people that have the difficult conversations with us. Our parents are the ones that have to show us tough love and tell us unpleasant things sometimes to get us back on the straight path and stop us from doing something evil or something that isn't right. So I would say that we have a lot of prophets in our homes with our parents, in our schools with our teachers, at our churches with our pastor and our deacon and all the other people that try to teach us. We have many people in our lives that try to preach the truth to us if only we would listen. And now that you're getting older, maybe it's time to start thinking about you being a prophet. Maybe God is trying to speak through you to somebody who needs to hear some unpleasant truth or an important message. Maybe there's a teammate. Maybe there's a person in your family. Maybe there's a classmate at school. Maybe there's someone who needs an attitude adjustment, who needs to know that they're doing something wrong. And even though it's difficult, God might be calling you to speak through yourself, your talents, your abilities, and God might be using you to bring that person to a better quality of life. So, as you continue to study towards the sacrament of confirmation, please realize that we're all called to be prophets. We're all called to witness to the truth in different ways and at different times in our lives. Thank you for listening, and here are your reflection questions that you should work on today. First of all, what is a prophet? Is it easy to be a prophet? Why or why not? Secondly, describe a time in your life when you have had to use tough love and function as a prophet to tell someone something unpleasant. And third, do you listen to people when they give you good advice? Do you realize that God might be trying to speak through them to help you? And do you listen to that advice that they give? Those are the reflection questions for today. I wish you good health and God bless you, and I hope to see you soon.